Welcome, Professor Charles Häberl, to Near East by Midwest with the NISA department here at The Ohio State University. We are delighted to have you with us today. Professor Häberl is a faculty member at Rutgers University and is a specialist of Semitic languages, the Mandaean tradition, and late antiquity. And Professor Häberl has been seminal in shedding light on the Mandaean tradition and its cultural heritage and texts and origins, as well as its contemporary heritage. So thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Häberl, and thank you for joining the North Atlantic Conference on Afro-Asiatic Linguistics, which we're very excited to be hosting this year. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
So if we can begin, for those who are uninitiated, could you tell us what is Mandaeism and why is it unique and important to understanding the Near East and Middle East, both in ancient times and in modern times?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer succinctly, but Mandaeism is, in a nutshell, the complex assemblage of lived experience, culture, religion, society, practices, foodways, and so on and so forth, of an ethno-religious community from the marshy lands at the head of the Gulf, known as Mandaeans, hence the name. And they are sometimes described as the somewhat mysterious fourth people of the book in the Quran. Sometimes they are described as the last surviving Gnostic community from late antiquity. Both of these descriptions are not unproblematic, but they're useful in communicating their relevance to a broader audience. And so they've been the subject of my research now for, well, going on nearly 30 years. And it's sort of become the focus of what I do, even though I have interest in other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And to follow up on that, could you explain what is Gnosticism? What's the criteria for a tradition to be included within that classification? And do you think that there's compelling reasons to include Mandaeanism within that?
Yeah, well, it's sort of the Wild West. It's not an easy question to answer because no one is in agreement, at least no scholars are in agreement about what Gnosticism necessarily entails. Generally, when people talk about what makes a Gnostic faith, there are different ways of measuring it. There's genealogically. So in the past, particularly certain Christian authors would say, oh, Gnosticism is a term for those religions that ultimately derive from Simon Magus and is represented by these great Christian heresies of late antiquity. Obviously, I don't espouse that. Another way of describing it, as Hans Jonas did, is a religion of profound alienation. So in the 3rd century of the Common Era, a lot of people, then as now, were losing faith in their institutions, their political institutions, their economic institutions, their religious institutions, chief and foremost. And what we saw in this alienation was a kind of dissatisfaction and even reversal of the same institution. So, for example, we see in a kind of hermeneutic inversion those figures who were considered heroes in a lot of the religious traditions of those times were turned into villains, and so on and so forth. And so one hallmark of a lot of Gnostic traditions, although not exclusively Gnostic traditions, by the way, is that they tend to do this sort of approach to the text that inverts it. They say there's a hidden meaning here. It's not one that you would expect, and actually it's quite the opposite of what you were expecting. Other features of a Gnostic religion include a belief in fate, which is to say the control of outside supernatural forces, such as the stars and the planets, to control our lives. That may or may not be applicable to all of these traditions. The belief that the world was created by a demiurge, a kind of cosmic figure who is not the real true God, but one who believes that he is the true God. And this is certainly the case for most, if not all, of the traditions we call Gnostic. And there are other features as well. So what we need to be aware of, as with the study of any religion is that these terms, even the term religion, is just a kind of a useful category, right? It's a box into which we put stuff, and we only use it to contain things, metaphorically. And so I find it in my work very useful to describe traditions as Gnostic because it helps me communicate to other people exactly where we stand and what other phenomena in late antiquity might belong to these categories. But I don't necessarily feel like Gnosticism in and of itself is necessarily a discrete and hardbound category, right? And there are Gnostic maximalists and there are Gnostic minimalists. There are people who would say, oh, everything is Gnostic, and we can even talk about Christian Gnosticism, Jewish Gnosticism. There are some who would say, like Hans Jonas, that it's a possibility inherent possibly in any religion. And there are others who would say it's minimal, right? We would only classify, for example, Valentinians, which is a tradition within Christianity, or Manichaeans as being true Gnostics, although even some of the scholars of these traditions would beg to differ. So, in short, you had asked me whether Mandaeans belong to this group of religions, and I would say, if they do not, then really there is no meaning to this category, because we have at present only really one group, right, for whom we have an entire corpus of texts, right? Every other community that we discuss that we call Gnostic, we only have fragments of their texts, very often copied by other people, often in polemical contexts, trying to make these religions look very bad. We only have one living community, which has preserved the meaning of these texts over, 2,000 years for us and tells us exactly how they understand these texts, which is something we can only infer from the small selection of texts we have for other communities as well. And then finally, it's the only community, to my knowledge, that refers to itself with a word that means those who know, which, as you probably are aware, Gnostic means in Greek. And so the word manda, right, comes from an Aramaic root, mada, meaning knowledge. And so Mandaeans are quite literally those who know. And for that reason, I would say that any sort of history or study of Gnosticism to understand what this phenomenon exactly entails, or let's not call it a phenomenon, but a category, it really should depart from the study of Mandaeans and then proceed forward, because only with Mandaeans are we on really secure ground. In the case of almost every other tradition that I've mentioned, we're left with working with very little data.
So when you talk about data, you're also a scholar of Semitic languages, and you're obviously working with the texts of this community. What about their scripture is unique to their context and differentiates it from other scriptures that were circulating during that time, particularly scriptures that are associated with the Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, and later the Islamic tradition? And what tools are necessary to understand its language, understand its script, and how do you go about doing that in your research?
I would say that the Mandaean scriptures are simultaneously unique, but at the same time quite well situated within the history of the region. So to explain what I mean by that, we who study the Middle East are almost embarrassed by the riches of literature at our hands. And we have to stop and think for a second and how uniquely privileged we are, because there are probably, by some guesses, as many as 6,000 languages spoken in the world today. And of those 6,000 languages, then and now, certainly fewer than 100 have produced what we could call a written literature. So Mandaeans are unique among them, and they are exponents of this literature in Mandaic, which is, after all, a form of Aramaic, so one of the most ancient languages that has appeared in written form. I think about it. There are very few languages out there that have made the 3,000-year mark, right? Egyptian, now dead, is one of them. Chinese certainly is another language, depending on when you assign our earliest Chinese text, but it's certainly been around for more than 3,000 years. Hebrew is there, almost there, right? Our earliest Hebrew texts, if indeed they are actually Hebrew, date to around the same time the Aramaic inscriptions start appearing, maybe a little later, but that could be done by a new discovery in the Middle East. And so For those of us, and Akkadian, of course, Sumerian, all these very ancient languages that didn't survive like Aramaic did. So we sort of take it for granted that we have literatures and they go back thousands of years. But like cross-linguistically, cross-historically, this is a very rare situation. Now, within that context, we have a vast literature in Mandaic. There are tons of books, right? And I say tons, if we were to go to Barnes and Nobles right now, it would probably just fill a shelf or a couple of shelves of literature. But when we're talking about ancient literature, that's a lot. And, when we're talking about this region, of course, it doesn't compare to Arabic. Of course, it's even less than we would have in terms of manuscripts of Syriac and Greek and these other languages that are spoken in the region. But it's a lot. The thing that makes it really special is that it's a literature that is curated to this day by a community, as I mentioned earlier. That makes it interesting to me because I'm interested in ancient texts, but also modern people. So getting back to your question about what makes it unique, what makes it special. Well, first of all, it's written in its own unique script, right? No other religious community uses this script. And in fact, as you're probably aware, in the Middle East, people tend to write their languages in the script of their community. It's very sectarian. So if I were a Jew in Baghdad and I spoke Arabic, I probably could write the Arabic script. But if I were writing notes in my family or writing my own dialect, I would probably use the Hebrew script. And same thing for Christians in Lebanon. They may not know any Syriac. They may only speak Arabic. But when they write, at least in the pre-modern times, they would write their Arabic in the Syriac script. This is called Kershoni or Karshuni. So Mandaeans do the same. Most of their literature is in their form of Aramaic. Some of it, there is a little bit in Arabic, and those things are written in the Mandaic script as well. So that's number one, the unique language and the unique script in which it's written. Number two is that it provides us with a view of the Middle East, which is fundamentally different, even alien from that of the sort of larger hegemonic cultures that shaped the Middle East. So, right, a lot of my colleagues, when they want to learn about the Middle East, will go to Greek and Latin sources, especially the classicists, of course. Those people who are interested in the Islamic Middle East or Islamic Near East will go to Arabic and Persian and later Turkish and whatnot. If you're interested in Jewish studies, history of Judaism, there's Hebrew and there's Aramaic too, of course. But all of these are ultimately associated in the past with states, and sometimes even empires, arguably. Mandaeans have never governed themselves. They've never governed other people. They've always been subject to other powers, and so they are a characteristic subaltern. So by reading their literature, and they do talk about the Middle East historically, about their region historically, we actually have a view from below that we don't get from a lot of other communities in the Middle East that we know about. We read about them in the accounts of Christians and Jews and Muslims, but we have no sources about them in their own words. They're completely mute. So scholars have been forced to construct all kinds of very elaborate stories for these peoples. But in the Mandaeans, we actually have their words that we can take for granted. And we don't need to construct anything for them. That hasn't stopped some of my colleagues from doing so. But we can take their words at face value. We don't have to assume that they necessarily correspond to a reality, but they're valuable in and of themselves as a different perspective on the history of this region. And sometimes they fill in the gaps where huge holes exist, right? Like there is an Islamic dynasty in the south of Iran, in what is today the province of Khuzestan, called the Mushasha, which are very important in the spread of Shiism into Iran. As you know, Iran is the largest 12er Shi'i state in the world. It's the official sect of the state. But it entered via basically from this territory at the head of the Gulf. And so this is one of the first to adopt this sect of Islam. And Mandaean sources, the colophons and the manuscripts that they copied during those times, talk about Mushasha'i rulers in ways that we don't even find in Arabic and Persian sources. So this is a view of a very important dynasty for the early modern period, for the history of Iran, for the history of the Arabs, for the history of Islam. And it's almost virtually unused by scholars of any of these things. So that's another reason why I feel like Mandaean sources and Mandaean literature are valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, the Mandaean community still survives today,
Correct.
although in small numbers. And there's been a recent diaspora due to what's been happening in Iraq in 2003 and what came afterwards. Can you speak about broadly as a historian, when you look at how this community has endured from their conception till today, uh, what does it tell us about resilience and the evolution of stories from what you can gather from their texts, and how much you can draw a line from an ancient community to a modern community, and if that's a productive task for a historian, um, and how much you can take for granted?
Right. Well, it is the literature, and by the literature I mean it's tradents, the priests who copied it and preserved it for us, that provide us with that direct line to antiquity. And we can see in the manuscripts, because Mandaeans, like a lot of other religious traditions, place a very high premium on the authenticity of their texts. So the copyists will write for us whom they copied it from, what sort of steps they took to make sure that they copied it correctly, and so on and so forth. And our chains are quite long, dozens and dozens of people, spanning hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in the course of this, they will write, which is called a tarikh, right from the Arabic, explaining the circumstances under which they copied these manuscripts. So they'll talk about what was going on. They talk about their rulers, sometimes very positively, other times not so positively when they've experienced persecution. So this is another way in which we can construct a history of the community and of the region around them, from sources which may otherwise be invisible, right? A lot of my colleagues will say, well, we don't know anything about Mandaeans before Islam, if we ignore Mandaean sources. Oh, well, we don't know anything about Mandaeans in the medieval period, again, if we ignore Islam, Mandaean sources. So even my own colleague, who's inspired my work quite a lot, Jorunn Jacobsen Buckley, she's a mentor of mine, describes the Middle Ages, right, as the kind of obscure dark centuries because of the lack of information about Mandaeans during this period. So it's not easy. It's a fraught task to kind of identify a community which is so underrepresented, even in the literatures of their contemporaries, even the Syriac and Arabic sources. But I think it's a fruitful exercise because it illustrates sides of the Middle East that we didn't know that we haven't, that are accessible to us in one way. So returning now to the question about what this means about resilience and survival. Mandaeans provide an interesting case studies simply because they survive where other Gnostic traditions have not. And fundamentally, I think this is, and my colleague Edwin Yamauchi, who used to teach not too far from here at Miami University in Ohio, described their ethics as being somewhat different from those of other so-called Gnostic communities. So when we read the Christian sources, in particular about Gnostics, we hear about how they had, for lack of a better word, rather extreme practices. They didn't have children. They abstained from sexual intercourse. They had a very anti-life, anti-world approach, whereas Mandaeans actually have a very life-affirming perspective. In fact, for them, the supreme being, Hey Rabbi, is the great life almost incarnate, right? Although incarnate is perhaps not the best word to use for a supreme being or a deity, but life is extremely important for them, and therefore they do not take lives. They are pacifists. They're very humble people. They're even restricted in the foods and the diets they eat. They're primarily pescatarian, right? They believe in being married and having lots of children, unlike perhaps some other Gnostic communities that we know of, Manichaeans in particular, who would consider for certain of their members these to be virtually a sin. So in that respect, their life-affirming ideology is one of the things that gave them this resilience, in my opinion. The other is this humility of which I spoke, and this I can illustrate with several anecdotes. So a good example of this is the sort of the doyen of Mandaean studies in the 20th century, with this woman named Ethel Stephana Drower, and she was the wife of Edwin Drower, Sir Edwin Drower, who was the Mufattash al-Adl under the British Mandate for Mesopotamia. He's kind of like the chief jurist, right, almost the head of the, for lack of a better word, like the Supreme Court or something like that for the British. And so she was there basically as an adjunct of the British colonial government in Iraq. She went to one of the sheikhs of the community at that point, maybe Sheikh Najm, maybe Sheikh Dakhil, I'm not sure which one. And she said, you know, there are these Assyrian Christians, Aramaic speaking like you, who are suing the British for an independent homeland in the plains of Nineveh up near Mosul. Why don't you Mandaeans do the same thing? And the Mandaeans said something along the lines of, lady, are you crazy? They would kill us, right? You know, like, what do we need to have our own state for? We don't want to have, we just want to live peacefully with the people around us. And he was right. He was more of an astute student of political science than Lady Drower was, because it wasn't long after that that the Assyrians were massacred by their neighbors at Simele, precisely because they were seeking an independent state in the northern part of Iraq. So that humility and also that that attitude towards government and self-government, and getting along with your neighbors, pacifism, not seeking control over other people, I think has also led to their long-term survival in a very difficult region.
And a lot of those characteristics, I'm sure, come from, studying sources, but you've also, as I understand, conducted fieldwork. What does fieldwork look like with regard to uh, investigating the Mandaean community? And perhaps you could walk us through what a day in fieldwork would sort of look like.
I've done field work with several communities at this point. I'm currently engaged in field work with several communities in the Middle East, and it's basically different for every community. So, as you mentioned, most Mandaeans entered into diaspora in 2003. So, the communities in their ancient homelands in Iraq and Iran are quite small at this point. And those in Iraq gave up their language. They shifted to Arabic entirely at some point during the 20th century. So there's not much work for someone who's doing linguistic field work in those countries. Now, there is a sizable language speaker community in Ahvaz in Iran, but, I have no passport other than an American one. And as you might imagine, that has its own attendant problems when doing field work, because the whole concept of field work, because of my predecessors in the field, is sort of associated with skullduggery. Right, we even talk about the people with whom we work, our cultural experts, as informants, right? So, if I, as an American, show up in the Iran-Iraq border with a tape recorder and a lot of recording information and say, oh, I'm just here to do this, work with informants, then of course the government's going to be like, what is this guy doing? Who does he think he is? So that is why most of my Mandaean field work has occurred with people in the diaspora, this large global diaspora in places like Sweden, Australia, and of course the United States. So you asked me about field work. There are many different types of field work. I started by cutting my teeth on linguistic field work, and that involved basically sitting down with language experts and trying to communicate with them in my halting Mandaic. And it's very difficult because from some languages, like if you study Arabic here at OSU, you will work, I presume, with El Kitab fi Ta'allum al-Arabiya, right? Something like that, like the Big Red Book. And there are guides for teaching adults how to learn the language. There's nothing like that for Mandaic. So you are thrust into the role, and by the way, they have no experience with teaching adults either. Either you know it, you grew up with it from the cradle on, or you don't. That's it, even within their own community. So you're thrust into the role of basically becoming an infant again, and infantilizing yourself and trying to get from them little pearls and nuggets of language. And this can be a very humiliating experience, but the best way I've found is to kind of let them take control. Tell them what they want you to hear, like engage you in their own projects, of which there are many. And they provide you with a grist for your linguistic meals, a mill. So I collected quite a lot of stories, folk tales, descriptions of life. As you might imagine, when I was doing my work, it was during the Iraq War, so I got lots of horror stories, oral histories that was going on in Iraq at the time with the Mandaean community. And from these, I extracted, in the matter of processing, a grammar of the language. right, based upon text, rather than, for example, one thing that some of my colleagues will do is elicit things from speakers. Will say, so how do you say this? How do you say that? Here are some sentences. I'm going to see whether or not there's pro-drop in this language. I want to extrem. I don't recommend that. I recommend connected text. If you have multiple speakers sitting around chewing the fat, even better yet, the more you can make them forget that you're there, the better, right? This is, in some circles, this is called participant observation, which is a term that I and others borrow from the jargon of ethnographic fieldwork, which is the other area in which I'm working. So, as I might have mentioned, I collect multiple texts. These texts are multi-purpose and multi-use. There are oral histories, there are recipes, there are folk tales, there are life stories, there are descriptions of religious rituals, and so on and so forth. And this, in a nutshell, is ethnography, right? It's. I didn't see it as such when I was doing it, but I found that in generating useful texts, for the purposes of just studying a grammar of a language, collecting texts like these also makes your work relevant and interesting to people working in other fields, right? Oral histories of the Middle East are very useful, right? Recipes and religious descriptions are also very useful even for members of the community, right? I've had priests come up to me and say, oh, wow, this is very interesting. I find what you collected here very interesting. Can you tell me more about this, right? And they're the experts, but many of them are thirsty enough for knowledge to be able to say, okay, I need to know what they're doing in this other part of our community, or what this priest says, or what that person says.
Mm-hmm. And Mandaean would be considered an endangered language, correct?
Yes, it's very much
Yes.
so.
And how do you work with these communities, if at all, to create infrastructure to protect this language and make sure that it endures?
That is a very tough question, because at the end of the day, I am just an outsider, especially in a community which, I didn't mention this before, but the community is closed, right? They don't admit converts. If you marry out of the community, that's it. Your children aren't considered Mandaeans, certainly. You may not even be considered a real Mandaean. And because of this history of, at times, persecution, they are sometimes skeptical about outsiders and their interests in their community. So ultimately, as an outsider, there's only so much I can do, right? It ultimately relies upon language activists from within the community, of which I'm grateful there are many, to save the language, because I can't force people to use it.
Yeah.
People have said, recently I was in Den Haag in the Netherlands, and a woman asked me, why don't you tell our children they should be Mandaeans and they should marry Mandaean women and they should speak Mandaic? And before I could answer, one of my senior colleagues stood up and said, it's not my job to tell you how to raise your children, which I agree with. I wouldn't have put it that way. The Dutch are famous, I guess, for their directness. I would have been a little more diplomatic in my response, but he was totally right. So it is very often the case that field linguists, such as those of us assembled here at the North Atlantic Conference on Afro-Asiatic Linguistics, produce materials, references for languages, dictionaries, grammars, text collections, and so on and so forth. And these are useful for the kind of purposes that you're describing as well. But they're not enough, right? Very often, in fact, communities will say, thank God our language is saved, and they'll buy the book or copy it or print it or whatever and put it on their shelves, and that's where it stops. And that is not how you save a language. You save a language by having creches where you teach infants, newly born infants, to speak and use the language. You save the language by committing to using it in your daily life. Right? Whether that's on social media or in communication with partners within your own community, but it has to be an endeavor that is shared by the community and not just by experts, whether from within or outside of the community.
No, thank you for clarifying that. I want to take us back a little bit to um, the debate among scholars between Palestinian versus Mesopotamian origins. What's at stake with that debate? And could you also, for those who aren't familiar with the Mandaean Book of John or their other scriptures that you've very influentially translated and created editions for, Could you speak about why that debate even exists because of certain references to John the Baptist, Adam, Moses, these familiar figures to perhaps people of Abrahamic faiths, but that are very much prominent characters in the Mandaean scriptures, but in a way that, like you said earlier, inverts them?
Yeah. Well, not all of them are inverted. The figure of John is accepted and revered just as he is in the Islamic and Christian traditions. Um, and even among Jews like Josephus, Flavius Josephus, writes quite favorably about John the Baptist. So it was clear that this is a guy who was all around well-liked. And even the portrayal of Jesus is nuanced in Mandaean writings. Some people would say that they're very anti-Jesus, but I don't see that from my own readings, as the edition that I did of the Book of John, and other people might disagree. But really, when it comes to origins, this is one of the most important questions and my least favorite, I have to admit, because it doesn't matter so much to me. I don't believe in single origin. Perhaps coming from someone who grew up in the Garden State and grew up poor, and I was surrounded by people who come from all different origins. And if you ask me, what is your origin? I couldn't answer that authoritatively or succinctly. But so when people say, oh, they must be Palestinian origin, oh, they must be Mesopotamian origin, I don't believe in single origins for people, right? We're not like products, right? And I don't think there was one day a Mr. Mandaean who somehow on his own had children. It's not even biologically possible. And all those children produced more Mandaeans exactly. So there were a case, and it is clear from the religious scriptures as well, that there were people not in the Mandaean community who somehow subsequently became Mandaean. And this is somewhat controversial, like the idea that there was conversion, even though, of course, in their scriptures, in books like the Book of John, there were figures who were not Mandaean who became Mandaean. One of these, an example of this is Mariam, right? So she is mentioned in the Book of John under the name Marie, and she is a woman of Jewish ancestry who stumbles upon a Mandaean Mandi, a temple, and becomes a Mandaean. And she's rejected by her community, the Jewish community, for this. So that is a clear-cut example of at least one person who's non-Mandaean becoming Mandaean. So if not one person, why not others? So getting back to this, if I had to put on my detective's hat and say, okay, this is where Mandaeans come from, the model I would probably create would look something very much like that you find in the text, which is that there are these people. They identify very strongly with some of the roots in Palestine and some of the roots in Mesopotamia, right? And that their descendants represent both sides. It's very clear from their text that they situate at least part of their history, imagined or otherwise, in Jerusalem and its environs. And that those texts also engage figures like the figure of John the Baptist and whatnot. Now, unfortunately, quite a lot of scholarship on Mandaeans is explicitly apologetic. And by that I mean it attempts to demonstrate the authenticity of Mandaean claims either upon or against figures like John the Baptist. And this doesn't make sense for me. This is the work of a religious figure. It's not the work of a secular scholar to say whether or not Mandaeans have a claim upon John the Baptist that is so, more authentic or more clear than, say, someone from the Westboro Baptist Church or something like that, right? But there are some people who legitimately would say, oh, well, we're Christian. We have a much more authentic claim upon that figure. And that is absolutely not a task, I think, for a serious scholar. So going back to those figures, I do think, and my colleague James McGrath, whom you've mentioned as well, and he's done this quite fruitfully, I think, I do think that by studying the Mandaean depiction of figures like John the Baptist and the others whom we find in their texts, we can arrive at parts of the story that do not appear in the other standard accounts of the region and its history. Just as I said earlier when I said that Mandaeans were a subaltern community and they have a perspective which is unique upon the Middle East and its history, I think that is also true for figures like John the Baptist and Jesus and Mariam and all the others, right? So in that, in and of itself, is a lesson to be learned, a very valuable lesson, regardless of whether we engage in the polemicist opinion engagement of determining whether these ties are authentic or not. Which I said is ultimately a question that cannot be solved or answered. I cannot get in the time machine and go back to see, oh, are there Mandaeans in the audience here? John the Baptist, is he baptizing? Is that a Mandaean there? No, I can't do that. So we have to, at some point, just take what these communities say about their own histories at face value, and then depart from there and see what questions these observations can answer.
Yeah. You mentioned baptism, and I want to take us to the Quran now, if you don't mind. So, for centuries, different Muslim scholars have associated the Mandaeans with the Sabi'un, who are often listed in the Quran with the believers, the Jews, and the Christians, and then they're that fourth group, which different people have claimed to be different groups throughout time. Where did this connection come from historically? What's the evidence for it? And what do you think is the most compelling answer?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's obviously an individual perspective. Like what compels someone is so I have colleagues who absolutely, positively will not even consider other evidence, right? This is not a good, it's not a good look in a scholar, but they will just simply say, I'm not convinced, right? There are, as you're probably well aware, multiple ways to understand who the Sabi'un are. It's very clear among our earliest exegetes and historians of the Muslim world, like Mas'udi and Tabari and whatnot, that there's total confusion about who they were. And even within the first 3 centuries of the Islamic era, people weren't exactly sure who they are. And some of our lists are quite wide-ranging. Oh, maybe it's these Greeks, maybe it's the Chinese. I don't know who it is. Is it Hindus? I don't know. So we're left to our own devices to decide who it is, because our texts do not get us any closer than we need to be. Some people have taken a linguistic approach, and they say, okay, this word looks like it may pertain to one of two or possibly more Arabic roots. One of them seems to be a peculiar pronunciation of sabaha, right? A root meaning to be immersed or dunked. And this interpretation seems to be the majority opinion. It seems to be corroborated by figures like Ibn al-Adim and al-Biruni, who refers to them as the Mughtasila, right? Those who are washed, right? And we do know that they practiced baptism, and that was one of, even in antiquity, when people talk about who Sabians are, they seem to be associated with baptism. And it just so happens that this root in Aramaic, right, if you look at sound correspondences between languages, and that's what we're doing here after all as linguists, corresponds to a root saba'a with an ayn, right? So you would expect, if it came from Aramaic root and not Arabic, instead of sabihun, it would be something like sabi'un, correct? However, in one form of Aramaic, not just one, but in the area that we're talking about here, in the areas where people practice baptism, southern Mesopotamia, where Sabaeans are very often, by these early Islamic historians, situated, there is a dialect in which they drop the ayn, and it becomes a glottal stop, a hamza. And that dialect is Mandaic. So it looks an awful lot like me, and obviously I'm partial, to say that Sabi'un is a Mandaic form of the same root meaning to baptize, as is abundantly demonstrated by the compared evidence from Syriac and Arabic, right? It sounds like a Mesopotamian Aramaic pronunciation, which makes sense given what later historians have said about where we find these people. The minority opinion, albeit quite popular then as now in the early Islamic sources, but also among modern scholars who don't quite buy that Mandaeans are legitimate Sabians, is that it has to do with a root that means someone who changed their religion. So in that case, the four peoples of the books would be Muslims, Christians, Jews, and those who changed their religion. To what I don't know, but presumably Islam, but so you get Muslims twice. I have to say, I don't find this terribly convincing. I don't think it jars well with the historic evidence about Sabians going into the classical period of Islamic literature. That being said, right, Again, this is one of those areas for which I can claim no particular insight beyond what I've just related to you. I will say I am partial to the idea that the ancestors of today's Mandaeans, let us put it that way, were these Sabians of the Quran. That they have many of the same features, albeit not all of them. And that, I do think that they are present in the period before Islam. I think the colophons and the texts that we have demonstrate it abundantly. And I do think that at least some Muslims who encountered them then identified with them as Sabians. And that identification has persisted to the present day. So even to this day, when you ask people who are Sabians in Iraq or Iran, they'll say, oh, it's these people, the Sabah, right? There's no confusion about that. The only confusion that exists was basically introduced by Orientalists. Scholars just said, no, I don't think these are real Sabians, right? They came along, and then all of a sudden, total confusion reigned in the area. And I think that has actually contributed to the marginalization and perhaps even persecution by extremist elements in their countries of origin.
That's really fascinating and insightful. Obviously, you've dedicated so much to understanding this community, understanding its context, and its history. Did you always know that this is what you wanted to do? And if not, how did you come to discover this passion?
Well, that's a long story. I mean, how much time do we have, really?
However much you like.
So I grew up down the shore, as I often tell people, in a bar, right? My family were bartenders, and we had a bar that had been in the family for 3 generations. Then we lost it because of economic circumstances prevailing in my hometown. Basically, in short, the tourism industry was imperiled by the appearance of medical waste on our shores emanating from the city of New York. And so I had to give up my dream of being a bartender like the previous generations of my family and had to go to college. I was the first man in my family to do that. So I went to school. And because my family could not afford to send me to college, I had to pay for it myself, which I did by working 3 jobs. You could do it in those days. Nowadays, I doubt even Ohio State, you could probably afford working 3 jobs. You'd have to work 5 or 6 or 7. I don't know. Because I was paying for it, that gave me the freedom to pursue what I wanted to pursue and not what my parents or anyone else wanted me to pursue. And I decided it was going to be archaeology. Now, in those days, it was concerned, and I should also add by a way of aside, that it was my mother who inspired this interest in me. She was a school teacher. And this is during the 1980s when there was a bit of what they call the satanic panic, right? Like if you've watched Stranger Things, you have an idea of the cultural context in which it's emerged. I was into, magic and Dungeons and Dragons and all the things that those children in that show were. And my mother, who was an educator at heart, tried to channel this interest by buying me a copy of the British Museum catalog. So I was reading through this, and among other things in that catalog were Mandaic incantation bowls, and I was fascinated by it. Perhaps it was the convergence of these bowls with the film Ghostbusters that came out around the same time in 1981, 1982, around then. It's when I saw it. I'm dating myself here. And the Ghostbusters had a device, which is a trap for ghosts, and it was just like the bowls in the British Museum. And I was like, wow, and it sparked my interest in archaeology, because if those things came out of the ground, what else could possibly come out of the ground? So I went, and given my early interest in inscriptions, particularly these incantation texts, I decided to learn epigraphy. This is the study of inscriptions from the recovered in archaeological contexts. My instructor then was a man named Bill Ward. He's a student of Cyrus Gordon, and he had taught for many years at the American University of Beirut. And there he had some students who came from the Aramaic-speaking communities of the Middle East, chiefly Assyrian Christians. And he told me one day while we're poring over some Aramaic texts, I had some students who could speak this. They spoke it in their home, and they could read this like we read the Sunday Times. And I thought to myself, I want to meet those people. So, when I applied for graduate studies, I had my choices between continuing to pursue archaeology or going more directly into NILC-type things. And I decided I like learning languages so much, even more than playing around in the dirt, that I decided to pursue the study of those languages. And as it would happen, shortly after I arrived at Harvard, there was a priest by the name of Abuna Shafiq Abu Zaid, who wanted to hold a conference on Mandaeans. And I was a new grad student, so what they did was, okay, you're the grad student, you have to do all the legwork. I went around and I found hotel rooms for Mandaean priests because we were bringing priests to the conference, and they needed to be situated close to water so that they could perform their daily ablutions, and they would only drink living water from the river and perform baptisms as we did it. We organized the first baptism in the New World there for that purpose of that conference. And it became a sort of Mandaean Congress, because Mandaeans came from all over, not just the New World, but also some even from the Middle East. We had 3 Mandaean priests arrive from Iran. And the first time I heard Mandaic spoken actually was when they described on the stage there their experiences trying to get through customs and immigration in Mandaic, which was tough for them, being Mandaean priests from Iran. But I digress. So I had to get permits. I had to go to the Metropolitan District Commission to ensure that we would be able to set up for the baptism on the Charles River, and I even got them to change the name of the Charles River to the Jordan, right? So there's self-denial as part of my graduate student experience. So ostensibly, the conference was organized by the big shots, by Chip Coakley, by Yoram Buckley, by Abuna Shafiq, but I was doing a lot of legwork, and Mandaeans recognized this. And they said, wow, you've done such a good job. You found such great places for the priest to stay, and you got all the permits and whatnot. You are welcome to stay with us. And, if you know anything about the Middle East, you know that hospitality there is infamous, right? You basically have a standing invitation to join them in their homes, to eat their food, and to learn from them, which I took. So it was not lost on me that this was the community that had produced those incantation bowls that had fascinated me so much when I was only 10 years old. And that was where I began my fieldwork, by going as a grad student to Flushing, Queens, in the Queensboro of New York, and staying with these families and learning from them about their tradition and trying to inhabit this role of a child language learner, even though I was at that point in my late 20s. And that was really the beginning of the genesis of my entire career. So, I am eternally grateful. I mean, I may have helped in a small way to organize a conference, but what they've given me is an entire lifetime of experiences and knowledge and work, and I can never replace that.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure that work will keep you busy for many years to come. What is keeping you busy these days? Is there a new research project that you're hoping to publish anytime soon?
Yeah, I'm working on several of them. There's no shortage of work in this field, right? People always say, oh, well, there are no jobs. That may be true, but there's a lot of work, right? So I am collaborating right now with some colleagues at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow to document various forms of Aramaic in the Middle East. So I've already worked on Mandaic, which is an Eastern Aramaic language. I've spent years now working on Toroyo, which is another form of Aramaic spoken in the mountains of south central Turkey, right on the border with Syria, just north of the Syrian Panhandle, and the vicinity of Qamishli and that area. And we're hoping, we've already published many of the texts that we've collected from very often many of the very last fluent speakers in that area, typically elderly men and women who grew up at a time when there wasn't much else to speak other than perhaps Kurdish. But they were not educated in the Turkish school system, which has had a profound impact upon the ability of speakers in that area to communicate in their own language. So, and we're looking to produce a text collection, a grammar, and many other resources for the study of this language, focusing primarily upon those dialects that remain undocumented. So, there has been at this point well over 100 years of scholarship on Toroyo. It's one of the best known Aramaic dialects, but it focused primarily upon the dialects of 2 major centers. One of these is Midyat, which is kind of the metropolis of Torabdin, and the other one is Medan, which is the first language of some of the leading scholars of this field, like Shabbat Talai, my colleague at the University of Berlin, the Free University of Berlin, is a native speaker of this dialect, and he's produced a wealth of resources on it. But for the other towns like Becosione, Quarze, Sorino, and so on and so forth, we don't have nearly as much data. We don't have any standing grammars and so on and so forth. We just have a few texts here and there that were collected by our predecessors. In addition to that, my colleagues as well, and this is where the Russian connection comes in very handy, are engaged in the documentation of the language of Ma'alula, which is a form of Western Aramaic. Now, Toroyo, like Mandaic, is Eastern Aramaic, but it belongs to a different branch. People would describe Toroyo as being Central Aramaic, indicating both its geographic position and its relationship to other forms of Aramaic. In Ma'alula, they speak a purely Western form of Aramaic, indeed, the only surviving form of Western Aramaic. And this would be the descendant of these Palestinian dialects of Aramaic that were spoken in late antiquity, up until late antiquity. There were, up until the Syrian Civil War, 3 villages in Syria in the foothills of the Anti-Lebanon Mountains, in the Kalamun Mountains. Kalamun is a spur of the Anti-Lebanon Mountains. And then when the Civil War happened, one of these villages was destroyed, to the point where my informants say nothing lives there, not even the lizards. So this shows you how precarious the situation of an entire branch of Aramaic is, right? It's now down to 2 small villages, and even those are imperiled by the contemporary events that are unfolding before our eyes in Syria. So, the Civil War may have more or less ended, but the danger is still not completely gone. So we're hoping to add to the wealth of resources collected by my colleague Werner Arnold, now 30 or 40 years ago almost, and a lot has changed in those times, and expand our knowledge of how this language works, because it is really our only resource for understanding an entire branch, half of Aramaic. And so it's incredibly valuable. Not to say that the other dialects are any less valuable, not at all, but it tells us things that we cannot get from simply studying Eastern Aramaic. And of course, all of these languages are deeply precious.
Yeah. It's obvious that there is still a lot of work to be done. And a part of the intention of this podcast is to inspire students to see a potential future for them in these sorts of fields. If you could provide one piece of advice, either to your undergraduate self or to current undergraduates who are maybe looking to the field with perhaps some weariness, what advice would you give?
Well, obviously, I'm very passionate about this, and I think that you need to be. You have to basically ask yourself, can I imagine doing anything else, right? Can I imagine being an investment banker? Great, go be a banker, right? Can I imagine working in programming? Then great, do that. There's no reason why the work that I do has to be done within the context of a university. In fact, I think we need to decouple from that, because the situation, as you well know, of studying foreign languages, world languages, and cultures in American higher education is becoming increasingly tenuous and difficult. We've seen universities such as Chicago, which was always like one of the lodestars for the study of Near Eastern languages in the U.S., put their graduate programs on pause. We've seen universities like the University of Illinois and West Virginia University shut down entire language programs in schools and divisions. So I won't lie and say that the future is peachy, but I will say that this kind of work is done by scholars working not just in specifically the NELC framework, but in other academic disciplines, and even those who exist outside of the academy who can contribute fruitfully to this. I would say we have to get away from the idea that we have to work in academia in order to do this work, because it is so important and so precious. So even if tomorrow my employer said to me, I'm sorry, but we no longer believe in offering the languages of Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, and who knows, they very well might, I would still continue to do the work that I'm doing, because at the end of the day, we're cheap dates, right? All I need is a computer, a good recorder. You can do a lot of this even on your phone these days, and a plane ticket, or now even just a phone call or an internet connection to do the type of work that I do. It won't be as great. I won't have the same resources as I do working in an institution. But as you know, these resources are increasingly coming at a premium. So that's number one, which is that you have to be passionate about it. You have to be a bit nimble, right? Don't necessarily think, oh, I'm going to be just like my professor and I'm going to be teaching in an ELK program. You might decide to work in another discipline, right? I have a lot of colleagues who work in computational linguistics, who do work with Near Eastern languages, Middle Eastern languages, and they're brilliant, and the work they do is very valuable. And you know what? They help me a lot with my research, too, by providing me with digital tools to analyze the corpora. I should have mentioned that my colleagues with whom I work and in Moscow have created all kinds of wonderful tools digitally to analyze and process the text that we work with. And that was possible doing it in the ways that I did 20 years ago, but it's much faster and more precise when it's digitally aided. So we have need of people who have digital skills. We have need of people who are historically and religiously informed, right? It's possible that NELC graduates today may not be working in an ELK program. That does not mean that they won't be working in a religion department, because the demand for knowing about religions such as Islam, Judaism, Christianity, even Mandaeism is not going to go away. Not today, not tomorrow. Even if Americans suddenly decide, oh, I don't need to know foreign languages or world languages, English is enough. I think that's foolish. I think that's stupid. I think it's a decision many students are taking today, and I condemn them for that. But let's say they do. We still need historians. We still need scholars of religion. So I would say, when I say we need to be nimble, I think you need to be informed about what's happening in other disciplines, whether it's computer science, whether it's history, whether it's religion, and be skilled at linguistics, be skilled at philology, but also delve deeply into the theory and the praxis of these other disciplines as well. And that will help ensure you that you have a long and fruitful career ahead of you. Because there is, as I said, no end of work, right? I would not recommend that you get into biblical studies. I think biblical studies is great, don't get me wrong. I would not recommend that you get into classics, because it is, as the Chinese say, reheating cold rice, right? People try to take a new theoretical approach to the material, the corpus that they remain, the canon remains the same, right? It doesn't change that much. I find it so much more fruitful to be working with living people, with living traditions and new data that no one else has used before. And that is the real blessing of the sort of work that I do. It allows me to do that in a way that studying the canon of Western literature or the Bible or the classics does not afford me.
Well, it is such a pleasure to hear from you about your work and also read your work. We're so grateful to have you here visiting OSU, telling us about your research, and also presenting at the NACAL conference. We really appreciate your time, and thank you.
Thank you for being such a gracious host.